for the latest in our series of webinars based around the Apprenticeship Levy. You're probably aware that it's been in force, if I can put it like that, since April 2017 and has now kind of bedded in for a couple of years. So we thought it was appropriate to look at the impact, not just on levy employers, but perhaps those that are non-levy payers as well. I'm sure a few of you on the call are not yet big enough to be paying the levy. So we're going to look at how it's been implemented, what's worked, what hasn't, and what might be coming down the line. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Tony Allen, who's very much a friend to us at Just IT and Skills team. Those of you who've listened into some of our webinars before will know that his expertise is greatly valued. I'll let Tony say a few words in a minute about himself and what he's been up to, but just wanted to get a sense check to start of how you out there feel in the marketplace. So Sam, I think we've got a couple of polls just to gauge the level of engagement with apprenticeships today. Back over to you.
Absolutely, thank you, Richard. So on the right-hand side of your screen in just a moment, our first question to the audience: is your organisation utilising your apprenticeship levy funding correctly? I'm just going to give a few seconds here for those results to come in. I'll close the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And there we are.
So just want to, I can't see the results, Sam, so just want to give us a feel? So
certainly. So 55% of our audience voted yes, and 45% said no.
Okay, so that's interesting. And I think we've got a follow-up poll to that, is that right? Is there a second part to this?
Absolutely. So the next part of our poll here, if yes, how much has been spent? So please cast your votes now, audience. And our options here are 0 to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75, and 76 to 100%. And I will close the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And I'll now share those results. And our audience voted the majority within 0 to 25 seconds. That was 25% of the audience, 26 to 50, 13% 51 to 75, and 13% 76 to 100.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sam, for facilitating those, and obviously for you on the call for answering. That's kind of really interesting. I'm sure you're going to reflect on that, Tony, in some opening remarks. But do you want to just kind of share your background and what you've been up to over the last year, 18 months since we last had a call together?
Okay, Richard. Well, first of all, thanks very much for asking me back, and good morning to everyone on the webinar. Yes, just a little bit about my background. I've been running my own business now for just over 3 years, and things are going very well. Prior to that, I was a senior civil servant in what was then BIS, which is in those days where the apprenticeship unit was before it moved across to the Department for Education. And I was part of the team of senior civil servants that actually, when George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, announced we were going to have an apprenticeship levy, were thrust into a room to say, how on earth is all of this going to work then? So those were fun days. Prior to being a civil servant, I worked in 20 years in hospitality and catering for Whitbread. In more recent times, I've been helping and supporting a number of employers, a number of training providers and others, just through the whole apprenticeship levy, more recently ROTAT refresh, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a busy time on the apprenticeship front, definitely, and quite interesting, the poll results there, and it just sort of reflects, I think, what I'm hearing on the ground from employers. You know, there are 1 or 2 who are spending all of their levy and are beginning to think now about you know, the idea of co-investment, drawing down more money and all the rest of it. But the vast majority of those who I talk to are not spending all of their levy. And indeed, 1 or 2 of them, interestingly enough, are beginning to think about, is this an opportunity to transfer some of my levy out to my supply chain or companies who we work with. So yes, I think you know, it is taking business quite a time, I think, to come to terms with how apprenticeships work and all of that, and how they can really start to think about a return on investment on their levy.
Okay, so by the looks of it, my maths is stacking up about 59–60%. haven't spent very much, and the other 40% have spent some of it by the looks of it. How well do you think employers have generally kind of engaged with the process? Do you think it's been a policy that's been embraced and welcomed, or do you think there's been some resistance?
Well, I think if you look, I mean, there's a number of ways of trying to ascertain and determine that and to measure it. I mean, one of the ways is quite interesting. I remember when we set the levy up, we thought there was just short of 20,000 UK businesses would be levy payers. The latest stats I saw from the department showed that something approaching 17,000 of those actually have an apprenticeship account.
Okay.
So, 80% or so have at least thought about having an apprenticeship account.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, I think if you use that as the measure, I accept there might be others, but if you use that as the measure, then quite a few of the levy payers, are at least thinking about how they do it as opposed to just writing off the tax. And you can probably assume that the 2,000 therefore also that haven't chosen to do that are probably at the tail end of the apprenticeship sort of payment system where they won't be paying very much anyway. So.
Okay, so let's have a little look, and we've kind of put some pointers on the slides to kind of talk about here. Obviously, we've said it's 2 years old. Why was it introduced, very briefly, do you think?
The cynic in me says it was introduced because there was a hole in government finances at the time, so I think that's probably...
The political answer is?
To enhance the skills base in the UK, I think.
Okay, so yeah, so I think, I think the argument was that, post the financial crash at the back end of the whatever, 2008-9, organisations weren't investing in training, and this perhaps was a measure, some might argue rather a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but nevertheless it was a measure to try and encourage organisations to invest back in their staff and get the UK back up the productivity table. Is that kind of thing?
Absolutely.
Okay, this is a toughie. Has it been successful?
My personal take on it is that generally it has. The stats I quoted earlier about the number of businesses who have taken the trouble to register on the system says that a lot of them are thinking about it. There is an issue if you define success by the number of apprenticeship starts.
Yeah.
Then you might take a contrary because while starts are up on last year, you can't really look at last year. If you go back over 2 or 3 years, I think starts are still 20-odd% down on 2 years ago and 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So, it depends, I think, how you measure it, and it certainly depends who you talk to. Is the apprenticeship levy here to stay? I think it most definitely is, and I think it is.
Okay. In terms of kind of where are we now? I mean, my sense is that from my work with employers, that for those that perhaps had never engaged with apprenticeships before, particularly the larger employers, which never see the levy payers are, they're going to go through a due diligence process. They're going to go through some sort of sign-off process with their board or their L&D team or HR, whoever makes these decisions. And that whilst there were a few that kind of rushed the market that wanted to get that return investment in year one, we seem to have seen as with all new policies, they're betting in year one, and now year two, people seem to be embracing it. And as you said, the numbers are up, if that's any sort of reflection. Is that kind of where you think we are now?
I think that's right. I mean, when the levy was introduced, it changed the motivation for businesses to get involved in the apprenticeship space. I remember one very large high street retailer, household name, that we in government have been trying for about 5 years to get them to do apprenticeships, completely without success. And 2 weeks after the apprenticeship levy was announced, I had their group finance director on the phone asking me how many apprentices they'd have to get their levy back. And it certainly changed the conversation through, which had historically been traditionally a conversation with HR, to starting to involve finance people and all of that. It's also changed the nature of the learning and development funds within businesses, where a lot of businesses I've spoken to have said, well, I used to have a fund of X, but now we're paying the levy. I've got a fund of a third of X.
I've had some delighted L&D managers have conversations with me because they've suddenly got this pot of money they never had.
So, in a sense, it's forced companies to look at apprenticeships as a means of developing their workforce. Now, for someone who's an apprentice convert like me, you know, that's great news, frankly, because I think, you know, apprenticeships are a fantastic way of developing your workforce.
Good. So let's look at some of the changes, because it's fair to say where we are now is not where we were when the landscape and the levy came in 2017. So first point I've kind of put up there is less level 2 apprenticeships. Probably two things here, Toad, just to explain in case people don't know what we mean by the levels, because we tend to talk jargon, don't we, and it's not always clear. And what do you feel about that? What's the impact of that in terms of the social mobility of the country and all those kind of good stuff?
I mean, level 2 is the start point for apprenticeships, you know, equivalent to O-levels, GCSEs, all of that sort of thing. Historically, there were lots and lots and lots of level 2 apprenticeships, pre-levy and pre-apprenticeship frameworks, the old structure model versus the new employer-driven standards. And an impact of the levy has been to dramatically, well, not just the levy, also the introduction of standards and changes to funding has been, the impact of all of that, apprenticeship reform stuff, has been to reduce dramatically the number of apprenticeship level 2s. They're down about 40%. Now, personally, I think there are a couple of main reasons for that. One is that a few years ago, the funding level for apprenticeships, there used to be 2 levels of funding, a higher level for young people and a lower level for adults. A few years ago, the high level for young people was abolished and everything was funded at the adult rate, which cut the funding for providers, which made it less profitable for them. But the second reason is a direct impact of the levy, and that is you have to understand that the vast majority of level 2 apprenticeships were delivered by SMEs. Something like 90% of them, if we go back 3 or 4 years, 90% of level 2s were delivered by SMEs. SMEs now have to make a contribution to an apprentice. So they now only have to pay 5% from April. It was 10 for the last 2 years. It's now only 5. The point is, historically, SMEs got their apprenticeships for nothing. They didn't have to pay. So even a 10% or 5% contribution for very small businesses is an issue. I mean, it might not be very much. It might be just a couple of £100 spread across a year, but it's still a couple of £100 spread across a year. And that itself, to my mind, has been, particularly for 16 to 18-year-olds, an issue, and that's why those numbers are down.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you talk about your background in hospitality for 20 years, and I would imagine that was an area where a lot of level 2 apprentices kind of started. The other one I think that's probably had a big impact on, not something I know a huge amount about, but the health and social care sector with nurseries and social care workers, those sorts of things, was a critical supply chain of staff, wasn't it, in the sector? And you kind of hear on the news, don't you, that people are, you know, worrying about how they're going to survive, and there's not enough childcare places and so on and so forth. So I imagine that's had some sort of impact.
It is. So it's a combination of changing to the way the funding works, introducing the levy, SMEs having to pay. All.
Okay. Now, in contrast, another hot topic, because traditionally apprenticeships were, as you say, in the old frameworks, were kind of level 2, level 3, few level 4s. That's kind of where it went, wasn't it? With the new standards, there's been lots have been developed. I think there's over 400 different.
There are now about 415, I think.
You know, joke. You know, doctor. You can be an accountant. You can be a nuclear scientist. You can be an engineer. You can, you know, fully qualified HR professional. Can't do all through an apprenticeship, which is absolutely wonderful and fantastic. You can also do a full degree now. You don't have to go to university. You can do an apprenticeship, get paid, and still get the same equivalent qualification. The concern I think there's been, if I understand the mood right, Tony, is that some organisations have perhaps transferred monies that they may have traditionally spent on graduates or developing people through degrees in their management programmes into degree apprenticeships. What's your view on that?
There have been lots of unintended consequences
that's a good way of putting it.
Of the levy, and this is one of them. Now, it depends what your view is on this, and some people are really upset that a business with a large levy pot has chosen to spend its money on upskilling say the middle management level or what have you. My personal take on that is I'm not at all concerned by that. For decades in this country, we have moaned about the quality of our management. And we've moaned about the quality of in-company management programs.
Yeah.
Well, now we have a system where you have well-regulated, high-quality management programs.
Yeah.
Okay, we call them apprenticeships. Basically from team leader upwards.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. From team leader upwards, and it's a great opportunity, I think, for people who, if you take the words of the Chartered Management Institute, become accidental managers. They're promoted into management roles sort of almost unexpectedly, and there's a lot of people who need to reflect and have the opportunity to train and hone their skills in management in verticals. And I think that's really important.
I'm with you on this, and I think if the whole principle of the new standards was that the employers designed what was right for them, surely it would be a little bit hypocritical to then say, well, actually, if you, an organisation, know what your business needs in terms of developing the skills, if they determine that that is at degree level, whether it be management or a full, data science degree or an IT degree or whatever it might be, then surely they should have the opportunity to spend the money how they want to spend it.
Well, absolutely right. It is their levy, and most employers look upon it as their money. It's arguably public money, but they look upon it as their money, which in my view is fine, because that means they're taking ownership for that, and they will spend that in the way that best suits their business. And I don't see anything wrong with that.
I'll move to that. So the next, I think one of the biggest changes from the frameworks to the standards, and for those in the audience who may not be familiar with them, so the frameworks were very much unit-based qualifications, a little bit like NVQs, if you're familiar with NVQs, that were assessed by the training providers as they went along, and then the awarding body, whoever that might be, let's say a City and Guilds type organisation, would then kind of verify them, a bit like a school scenario where the teachers would teach and then the examining body would kind of give a final mark. We've gone now to the training providers delivering the training against the standard, but then an independent body, an awarding body, EPAO, actually giving the grade. What's been the impact of the endpoint assessments, and have they worked? Obviously not just within our sector, but you see across all different sectors. Have they worked?
I mean, again, personally, I'm in favour of endpoint assessment. I think the old frameworks, it was too easy for the training provider just to tick a box and decide somebody could do something, and that was it. So I welcome endpoint assessment as at least putting some rigour in and having that independent view from the training provider as to whether somebody is competent against the new standard.
Yeah.
Is it working? Do you know, I think it's still early days, and the reason I say that is, apprenticeship standards got off to a slow start, so we haven't yet seen the level of completions, because some of them take 2-3 years before the apprentice gets to the endpoint assessment. So I don't think we've seen the level of endpoint assessments in terms of the volume yet to be able to judge. I mean, I know initially the numbers were potentially quite disturbing, because we had rates down at 40-50% of apprentices were passing, that was all. I think now that, well, I know now that that number has increased. Interestingly enough, IFA and ESFA are very unwilling to share those numbers with us.
I know. I can only talk about the digital part of our business. You see, we have two branches, IT and skills team, and through all the IT apprenticeships, I know the main awarding bodies are about 90% passing, and about 24-25% of those getting distinctions, which is fantastic. Very few merits, interestingly. You seem to get a pass or distinction, but there's only a 10% failure rate nationally.
Which is good.
We're beating that ourselves, and we'll plug for ourselves there. I think we're about only 5% failure rate. We have really strong performance, but I think the thing I like about them, I've been an apprentice for 10 years, not as long as you, but I openly admit that, you know, with the old frameworks, sometimes you'd have conversations with the employer and the young person might have passed their apprenticeship and you say, are they any good at the job? You're going to keep them on at the end of it, and they go, no. The beauty of the standards, of course, they're measuring competence, knowledge and behaviour skills and attitudes. And because it really is a work-based learning thing, you know, the employer embraces it as much as the young person. They're not just giving somebody a chance, they're developing the person of the future. Surely must be the whole point of it.
Absolutely. You know, there have been some hiccups with it.
Yeah, of course. Like any new process.
We're seeing some inconsistencies for endpoint assessment organisations. One of the things that I do wish the government would do with endpoint assessment is the quality assurance of the endpoint assessment organisations, which currently can sit with a number of different organisations. I do just wish they'd give that all to one. And you know, and I think that would overnight solve the variability issue. But as I said, it's early days, but I think the signs are very encouraging.
Now, another one that we get a lot of conversations about, and I'm sure people on the call will recognise this, is this, and the government call it 20% off the job. I think that was a mistake in itself in terms of the way they worded it, but certainly for my experience of organisations where we are looking to, shall we say, workforce develop existing members of staff, so upskill existing members of staff, I think there's a lot of confusion around what 20% means. Let's kill it. For starters, it's not the old days of one day disappearing off to a college or a training provider or whatever. It's embedded throughout the program. But what impact, when you work with employers and with training providers, have you seen?
Well, I mean, it is undoubtedly, I have to say, it is a huge turn-off for some employers. And I know of fairly large employers who don't do apprenticeships because they maintain they cannot afford to backfill that employee for the equivalent of a day per week. So, you know, and I think that needs to be said up front. And I have personal views about whether 20% across every single apprenticeship standard in whatever sector at whatever level isn't a very, very blunt tool, because I think it is. Yes, there needs to be off-job training.
Of course it does.
No doubt about that. But whether somebody doing a retail level 2 and somebody doing the chartered management degree apprenticeship or a data analyst all need 20% off-job training, I would seriously contest. However, we are where we are. We have it. And you're absolutely right. It is completely misunderstood in many quarters. You know, people still think, because it comes out of the old college day a week thing, that that's where it has to work. It doesn't. You know, it could all be at the start of the apprenticeship. It could all be at the end of the apprenticeship. It can be interspersed throughout. It can be in block. And if you look at what it is, you know, it doesn't have to be where the person is sent away from their desk. You know, they can do online stuff at their desk. They can be supported. They can be mentored. They can go to a workshop. They can go to a conference. You know, all of these things, providing it's relevant to the standard, constitute 20%. And I think employers who take time to understand that and work it through have found ways that actually it works for them pretty well.
Good. Okay, the next kind of 2 or 3, I'm going to kind of lump together, because the changes in funding caps, the 5% contribution, and funding for SMEs, I think are possibly all. The open to all ages one, I think, is a very easy one, and I'm all for this. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Traditionally, as you said, with the way that the old frameworks worked, it was kind of 16 to 18 funding and kind of 19 to 23, and over that you struggled to get any funding, didn't you, back in the day? I think our oldest apprentice on programme is in their 60s, and whether you've had any experience
absolutely.
Your employer, which I think is just wonderful. You know, you and I are slightly older than 21. I think it's fair for the audience to realise. You know, it's hard to learn, aren't you, Tony? So do you want to cover the other 3 as a kind of a link together? So changes in funding caps, this co-funding contribution, and is there enough funding for SMEs? How would you view the world there?
I mean, changing in funding caps, the government has now looked at, I think, or it has either looked or is looking at 60 apprenticeship standards as part of a review of looking at them all in the fullness of time to determine whether the original funding level was right. So I guess the classic example is the chartered management degree apprenticeship, which was originally set for £27,000 as a maximum drawdown, and that's now been reduced to 22. Now, the government has been a bit opaque as to its rationale for some of the changes, and some of them are rather odd. But you have to come to the conclusion that it's made that change, particularly at that top end one with the charter management one, because it was worried about the number and the cost of all of that. So it'll be interesting to see how many sign-ups there are at 22,000 versus 27,000.
Yeah.
The co-funding bit, yeah, that's a definite attempt by government to get a greater number of SMEs. I referred to that earlier. I personally think, and as somebody spent lots and lots of time in the past going around talking to small business, one of the attractions of the old system of having an apprentice was you didn't have to pay. You can argue whether employers should pay. Personally, I think they should. But the practicalities are a lot of SMEs won't. Now, whether reducing it from 10 to 5 will make a heap of a difference, only the stats over time will tell us that. I have my doubts, but I hope I'm wrong. And the lack of funding for SMEs, well, this, again, for people who don't know, if you don't pay the apprenticeship levy, the way you access funding for an apprenticeship is via a training provider. And the government gives training providers a chunk of money to go out and spend on those companies that are not levy payers. That's in simple terms how it works.
Yeah.
They have not exactly restricted that funding, but there is undoubtedly, and I know of employers and training providers who could recruit far more apprentices if only the funding for SMEs was available. Broadly, most training providers have spent or have allocated already the money that they've got to spend on SMEs. There is undoubtedly far more demand than there is funding available. So that's a big issue, and government needs to do something about that.
Okay. Sam, before we move on, because that's just a quick recap of where we've been over the last couple of years, we're going to move on and talk about some of the ways that organisations can actually spend their levy, and then we'll end on how what the future might look like. We're turning to look into his crystal ball, as it were. But Sam, have you had any questions come through whilst you've been on the call that we might need to pose? I'm not sure, Sam. Are you with us, Sam? Just wondering, Sam, just before we move on to the next section, if you've had any questions come in you think would be appropriate.
Hello there. We haven't had any questions as of yet, and just a reminder to the audience that you can pop your questions into the chat panel as they come up. Thank you.
Right, okay, so if we move on to some of the ways and means, then we'll try and pick some examples. Some we'll talk about in more detail. The ways that perhaps organisations can spend their levy. So one of the most obvious ways, I guess, is new hires.
Yeah.
So you've got examples of
absolutely. That's the classic way to use your apprenticeship funding. You've got somebody new coming into the business, and they are obviously, by definition, they're new to your business, not job competent. So sitting down and looking at a relevant apprenticeship standard, and as you've said, Richard, there's over 400 of them now, and there are CIPS frameworks as well. That's a great way of using, your apprenticeship funding, levy funding, to train and develop and help the competency of that individual.
And I guess, not exclusively, but almost by definition, they're probably more likely to be kind of junior or entry-level type opportunities, where you would think about the traditional apprentice back in the day, where it used to be more trades, of kind of being taught how to do a skill and embedded into organisation and all those kind of stuff. Absolutely. So that's probably the most common way that most organisations will utilise their levy, and that's where HR very much come involved with the resource planning and looking at roles and what might be appropriate for an apprenticeship. But if we haven't got any HR professionals on the call, then I would advise that with so many apprenticeships out there, if you go onto the Direct Gov website, you'll see the list of all the categories. That you'll be amazed at what you can spend your levy on. The next one, I guess, is upskilling existing members of staff, which has probably only become more popular in my experience since the levy came in. I would say that's probably one of the most dramatic changes, actually, that we've certainly found as an organisation. I don't know whether that's been reflected.
Absolutely. Part of the apprenticeship reforms effectively allowed you to give or offer an apprenticeship to somebody, even if their education history is already at that level. So, if somebody has got already got a level 4 qualification in, I don't know, geography, for example, and they want to come into the IT sector, then they can do a level 4 apprenticeship, one of the many IT ones that are available. And that's a relatively new change. And companies sort of welcome that. I mean, the rules around that say that providing there is a significant amount of new learning that individual requires, then actually they can even do a lower level apprenticeship than their existing.
Because it's a new skill. So
because it's a new skill.
Exactly right. I mean, and I think that's really one of the welcome changes. Again, for the audience who might not know, in the past with the old frameworks, you kind of went up the levels from a level 2 to a level 3 to a level 4. You kind of progressed up, and you couldn't do if you already had a higher qualification, you could do something level. But just because you've got a degree in whatever science doesn't necessarily mean you're a great manager.
Absolutely not.
So the team leader, I think, is a level 3 qualification in terms of the hierarchy of qualifications, but actually you still need to learn to be a manager, don't you? You kind of evidence areas. So we certainly would just recommend looking at that as an option. I reckon probably about 25% of the apprentices we've helped over the last year have probably been existing staff that have upskilled, and that's reflective across the country. But really exciting. Then the next kind of couple that we'll kind of link together. So some organisations will want to run a training programme purely for their own staff. That's what I mean by kind of a closed cohort. Some organisations will want to put people on what I would call a public course, where they might be interacting with like-minded individuals doing a similar programme from other organisations. Do you have a view of whether, I don't think one is right or wrong, but do you have a view on what works?
It's entirely dependent on the organisation and what they want to get out of it, and there are definitely pros and cons of both. I mean, I've done some work with Tesco in the past, and I know because of their size, they're a massive employer. They do tend to do apprenticeships in closed cohorts, so there are just Tesco people on them. Equally, I know of other businesses, even though they might be large, who say, actually, one of the great things from an apprenticeship point of view is when our employee goes off and interacts with employees from other businesses. And learns stuff and networks and has all of that opportunity to see things beyond our corporate boundaries. And a lot of people and a lot of employers like that approach. So it just depends what you want to get out of it and what your apprentice wants to get out of it.
I'll perhaps share a couple of experiences from myself. I think there is an advantage on the closed cohort sometimes when organisations are looking to perhaps embed their values or for the training provider to build on the values that they may have. Don't want to home in too much on the management qualifications, but there are particular modules in there that perhaps are around performance management or around finance, and you need to kind of have the nuance of the way that organisation
you can personalise it,
delivers their performance management. You can really make it relevant. The other thing that's been quite interesting, we've done a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years with some of the London boroughs and NHS trusts, and they've become very commercial animals. They've kind of had to, because their budgets have been cut, and they've had to get the best pound for their buck, haven't they, in terms of what they can do with their money. And they found it really beneficial where perhaps they might have worked for an organisation for a long time, had a particular view, rightly, but actually then being able to share best practice with people from commercial organisations and private sector and third sector and all the rest of it has been really, really interesting. I think it's been interesting for our trainers and coaches as well, actually, to have mixed cohorts. So I think you're right. I think there are advantages and disadvantages of both. Do talk to your training providers about the options if you kind of get that chance. So other ways you can actually use it then. Something that I don't know whether you've had anything on, but we have to accept that apprentices aren't for everybody.
No,
I think you referenced earlier, the minimum length of time, if you don't know, you have to go apprenticeship is 12 months. It's a work-based learning program. So you need to embed those skills and knowledge and behaviours in the program. And as you said, some of them are 2 years, 3 years for degree apprenticeship, some of them are 3.5 years, aren't they? Retail management you were talking about earlier to me. So it's not right for everybody. Some people, prefer a short course. They can't commit for whatever length of time. One of the things that we found is that if you have got a closed cohort, it may be that your individual might want to join a module or a workshop relevant to them. And there will be a commercial price for that, no doubt, with your training provider to cover the cost of that person attending. But actually, that's an interesting mix that historically organisations wouldn't have the opportunity to do.
Absolutely. There are an awful lot of people, if we go back to existing employees, whether you put them on apprenticeship or not, yeah, you do have to demonstrate that they need a significant amount of new learning. Now, you might have somebody who actually could benefit from a third or a half of the content of the apprenticeship. Clearly, they're not eligible to do a whole apprenticeship. But you're right, there's nothing to stop you talking to your training provider. It's obviously a lot easier in a closed cohort, but it can still be done in an open one. Talking to them about how you can get those individuals to take part in some of the apprenticeship activities.
The other thing that I know I've heard has happened with some organisations is, sometimes you're not quite sure whether it's right for you. So kind of almost try the first session and see what it's like. I'm going to get something out of it. So, I think there are ways if you work with an enlightened training provider where you can kind of do these sorts of things. Yeah. Okay, a couple of other things. This has been I've really enjoyed this over the last year. I've worked with 2 or 3 quite large organisations where they've got some great people in their business and they want to keep them, but they might have kind of, reached their level within the particular role they're actually doing. And I've had one client say to me, again, a large retail organisation, who kind of reckon that they've got non-technical people they can transition into technical roles because they might be bedroom coders or they might be great digital marketers in their spare time. And they never thought they'd have the opportunity to actually demonstrate that skill. Have you had any experience of that with some of the projects you work with?
I mean, slightly outside of the IT space, where I can absolutely see that that's correct. But even as I say, on a more simplistic level, John Lewis, their home delivery service, one of the great restraints that they had on being able to expand that was they couldn't recruit enough van drivers. And frankly, the Brexit vote scared away some of their traditional Eastern European driver cohort. And what they have done, because in a few instances they've been slimming down frontline customer service staff in some of their stores, they have transferred those people through an apprenticeship. And now, whether van driving counts as a technical role or not, I'm not sure. But it's the same sort of thing where they've taken somebody over here who they don't need as many of now, and through an apprenticeship, I've moved them over here where they do.
And of course, the great advantage is that they're already, you already know they're a great employee. They already share your values.
Absolutely.
They're committed to you, and they're very, as an individual, they never thought they'd get that opportunity. As I say, we've had people come out of, retail stores or depots who actually have got wonderful skills, just never thought they'd have that opportunity. And whenever they've applied for a job, of course, it says you've got no experience.
Absolutely.
So the apprenticeship gives them that chance. And it's a wonderful thing that's really come out of it.
And you think what's happening in retail at the moment, where there are lots and lots of issues around, high street, there are people out there are thousands of employees for whom that might work.
And probably, our parents' generation, perhaps you did a job for life. The old gentleman joined the bank and you joined it for, you have to upskill and reskill. So even if you stay within an organisation, you're probably going to do 2, 3, 5, 7 different jobs over the life of your career. So the apprenticeships are a brilliant way of facilitating that, aren't they? Okay. One of the things that I'm quite passionate about is social mobility and obviously diversity and making sure, in London, we have a wonderful diverse community, don't we? And sometimes people fish in a very small pool. Apprenticeships enable you to fish in a wider pool, I think.
Oh, absolutely right. And, I've spoken to employers who, have asked me to come in and to advise them about apprenticeship programs. And, obviously I always start by trying to understand a bit more about their business and what their objectives are. And one of the questions I always ask them is about, the makeup of their workforce, and all of that. And, you sometimes see that light bulb moment where you say, well, you can use apprenticeships, which perhaps are a non-traditional method of getting people in your business and properly trained up, really able to grow and develop. And at the same time, you can start to think about people who historically and traditionally you wouldn't necessarily have employed into your business. It is still amazing to me how many, even relatively large businesses, rely on word of mouth of existing employees to recruit new people into the business. And by that, what you are doing is you are restricting to the sort of the social ethnic groups of your existing workforce. You know, you're not looking beyond that group if they are the main source of your new recruits. So, you know, and I think there's, and apprenticeships just help to facilitate all.
Well, I'm a great believer your own staff should be representative of your marketplace. If you're selling into a diverse marketplace, and your staff should be equally kind of diverse. So, you know, again, you know, most established training providers will help employers recruit.
Yes,
we certainly do. We also have a, you know, we're fairly unique, and we have a careers advisory business, Central Careers Hubs, that we work with that has reached out to 3,500 to 4,000 careers advisors into the schools. So, you know, we've run women in IT events, all sorts of things to try and get more girls into IT, for example. So apprenticeships, I really do think are a fabulous way of doing that. Now, the last one, which I think is a real plus of the levy that the government has brought in the last year, is the ability now for large employers. You said, and the poll at the very outset kind of said that, you know, that 50%, 60% had spent less than 25% of their levy. Well, you know, rather than letting that necessarily go back into the government coffers, which is what happens after 2 years if you're not spent it, of course. And obviously some employers are just starting to find that out now in May, where they get the first money taken away. You can gift it to a charity, to somebody in your supply chain, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. You know,
how much is it for starters?
Well, you can transfer, it was 10%, it's now 25% of your annual levy contribution to someone else, another employer or employers. So, you know, if you're a large employer, you might want to think about supporting your supply chain, or, you know, supporting other businesses that in some way contribute to your business. And it's relatively easy to do. It can all be done online. You know, the receiving organisation just has to agree the number of apprenticeships, which standards they're going to do, and all the rest of it. And you know, I think it is a great way. And you're right, we're now at the 2-year point where apprenticeship pots will not continue to grow automatically now, because it's done on a rolling 24 months. So if you've not spent month 1, you will lose it at month 25. You know, that's the way it works. Yeah, I'm aware of some businesses who have said to me, our pot's not growing now, and you know, we still got this rump of money that we seriously don't think we can spend. What can we do with it? And you know, this is a great way, as I say, of supporting companies and organisations, apprenticeship training associations, third sector organisations with employees. You know,
because employers are generally, in my experience, are non-levy payers. They tend to be smaller, don't they?
Oh, no, absolutely, yes, of course.
So, you know, that therefore means the concerns that we expressed earlier about not enough money for SMEs, not enough money, perhaps, you know, you were saying the level 2s were 90% hired by SMEs. If the SMEs are saying, actually, we'd love to do it, we can't afford it, this is a possible solution, isn't it?
I'll give you a great example. There's a company that runs about 12 shopping centres throughout the UK. They decided 3 or 4 months ago that they couldn't spend their levy, and they have just arranged with 2 growing retail businesses within their shopping centres to transfer some of their funds to them to allow those businesses to recruit apprentices.
Super. Yeah, we've got some, you know, different sectors actually. We've got some financial services companies that are gifting money to small organisations. I think it's a lovely CSR thing.
Well, absolutely.
But it absolutely is helping. I think that's a brilliant example in terms of supply chain. Yeah. Okay, Sam. So we just talked about, and we have, for those of you on the call, you'll see at the end, if you want more detail on that, any of those things, there is a brochure you'll be able to download when we send out the recording, just to give you a little bit more ideas and some hints and tips of how you can kind of utilise your levy. I think I'm coming back to you, Sam, now for the next poll.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so on the right-hand side of your screen in a moment, you should see the poll appear. I've launched the poll now, so please indicate all the ways that your company has used the levy to date. Okay, and please make your selection, audience. On the right-hand side there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we've got the upskill of existing staff, embed in-house training, transition of non-tech staff to tech roles, gifting levy funds, diversifying the talent pool. I'm going to shut the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so for our panel, the majority of the audience, 80% in fact, selected diversifying the talent pool. There were no votes for gifting of levy funds or transition of non-tech to tech roles, and equally, the remaining 40%, so 20% voted the upskill of existing staff and 20% to embed in-house training.
That's really interesting. That's possibly not what I expected. I'm encouraged by that. You said, was it 60% diversifying the talent pool, Sam?
80%, in fact.
Wow. So that's, I mean, I'm sure some people voted for more than one, but that's really, really encouraging if that's the case. Then you could argue our job is done here in the sense that people are getting the message.
I think that's right.
That's brilliant news.
I'm not surprised that nobody said they were transferring funds. I mean, whilst as we've just discussed, it is a great opportunity, and seriously, you know, a key message to take away from today, I think, for people out there is that if they're not spending their levy, and a lot of them aren't, to seriously think about that. The take-up has been relatively slow at the moment, and I think one of the reasons is that government's not very good at telling people they can do it.
I think the other flip side of that, if the people on the call are actually working for small SMEs who'd love to embrace apprenticeships but can't afford it for whatever reason, come and talk to your training providers, whether it be us or anybody else if you're in a different sector, because all of us will have relationships with organisations that are chomping at the bit to give their money. Yeah. So, do flip it around the other way if you want to have a conversation about that. Thank you, Sam. We're going to move on now to look at perhaps the future. This is where you give us share your insights from your inside knowledge of the sector, and also working with apprenticeships and what might come up. And obviously Tony and I have had a conversation about this to throw a few discussion points kind of in there. It's by no means exhaustive, but hopefully it will stimulate some conversation. So what about the degree apprenticeships as a credible alternative to university?
Oh, it's a great alternative to university. I mean, I'm a huge fan of degree apprenticeships. I actually think they're the best thing to come out of the apprenticeship reforms of the last few years, because it is a no-brainer. In a sense, why go to university for 3 or 4 years and rack up £50,000 worth of debt and come out of it without a job, when in a number of cases, and in an increasing number of cases, you can join a company at 18, go on a 4-year degree apprenticeship program, and when you come out of it, you've got a degree, you've got an apprenticeship in a lot of the sectors. So if you take the approach that Barclays and Santander have taken in the financial sector, you will have membership of the professional body for banking, and unless you've been particularly reckless with your money, you will have earned £20,000 a year, so you'll have earned 80,000, and you shouldn't have a £50,000 worth of debt. So, it is a great, that's why I think they are absolutely fantastic alternative. Now, there's not enough of them yet. The number of them are expanding. I just hope government doesn't do anything silly to try to restrict the intake for degree apprenticeships.
I think it's particularly relevant for the professionals. You said you become, as we said earlier, qualified accountant and qualified solicitor. You don't have to go to university. No. There are lots and lots of really high quality apprenticeship schemes with big employers out there, aren't there, that enable you to kind of get that qualification.
It's a great way, and I hope
could get that practical experience.
Absolutely.
There's plenty of people, that come out of university with a wonderful qualification, but they've got no practical experience. The beauty of this, of course, is that's not the.
And I hope that the government continues to promote and encourage degree apprenticeships.
And it's not just, for me, it's not just to share some personal experience. I've got 2 grown-up sons. One that went to university, the other that did an apprenticeship. Equally clever individuals, but it was their learning styles. My oldest son felt university was the way that he wanted to go. Jack felt the younger son felt that actually being in a working environment and getting the qualification was the route for him. So it's as much about learning style as it is. Okay, the next one is the thorny thing, and dare I say it, is the thorny subject of what impact. You alluded to it a little bit earlier with one of your examples. How can apprenticeships help solve the potential skill shortages that there's going to be in this country, whichever way Brexit pans out?
Well, I think we've talked already, Richard, in the last sort of 45 minutes about the answer to this, because I mean, you know, you can take people in a part of your business where you might not need them anymore, and through apprenticeships train them into a part of the business where you do. Now, whether that's frontline staff into support functions, into IT, just into another part of the business, and that's where, you know, a structured apprenticeship program is absolutely brilliant at doing that. And I personally think that companies who latch onto that after Brexit, because, you know, it is bound to make a difference. You know, whatever the post-Brexit landscape looks like, you know, unless we completely agree to free movement, and I don't think any government's going to agree to that as part of the Brexit thing, there are bound to be restrictions. It is bound to be harder to bring people from Europe into here to work. So therefore, the alternative has to be to look at the people we've already got and look at the people we've got within businesses and deploy them accordingly. Apprenticeships are a great way to do that.
Because you think it from a purely economic term, apart from the good of developing people from a training perspective, I guess if there are skill shortages in certain sectors, inevitably you're going to be in a little bit of a race to pinch people from other organisations.
Yeah.
It means having to pay them to come to you and so on and so forth, and it pushes salaries up, doesn't it? You know, why not train your own and grow your own in your methodology, your styles, with a structured training program, and make it cost effective for you as well. So it's a win-win for everybody, isn't it, really?
It is.
Okay, something obviously you were involved in developing back in the day when the levy was introduced was what's now effectively known as DAS, or Digital Account, or Digital Apprenticeship Service, which is the portal for those that don't know, that the levy payers effectively utilise to pay their monies, but non-levy payers are going to join the system as well.
They are. Originally that was due to happen April just gone. Government, I think, took fright at the prospect of that and rightly decided to think at that time that we're not quite ready for this yet. It is, as we speak, just about to run a trial for some SMEs who want to do this to, in effect, operate in the same way that levy-paying employers operate. And they'll be given access to a digital account online, which will enable them to draw down funding and to recruit apprentices. Now, as I understand, it'll be slightly different for them because, of course, they won't have their own levy pot of money because they're not levy payers, but they will still be able to log on, set themselves up in the same way that a levy employer does, and then say, right, I want a couple of apprentices, draw down the money, that's approved, and then their service account will show every month how much they're spending on.
I mean, on the one hand, it's almost like an online banking account, isn't it? It shows money coming in, money going out.
It is. You just won't have a positive balance in there like a levy.
No. But the other thing that people on the call might not realise is that you can recruit through that. You can advertise vacancies. You can search for every single apprenticeship that's going. You can search for every training provider that's approved to deliver by location, by sector. It's a really good.
It is.
Isn't it?
And as I've said, the government is trialling that with a number of SMEs throughout this summer, with a view that if that trial goes well, that everybody has the opportunity to do that from next April.
Next April, fantastic. So you've gone back a year. Okay. Again, we touched on this a little bit. You said there's this, did I hear you rightly, 60 apprenticeships currently having their funding caps reviewed? Because they tend to look at them every 3 years, don't they?
Well, yes, they do, although they, I mean, there are a couple of different ways that the Institute for Apprenticeships and now Technical Education, we have to call it IFATE now, are doing this. One, they're doing a sectoral review, so I think they've just done a digital around a number of apprenticeships, and they're making decisions about whether that standard continues, or I think in the case of IT, they're suggesting some
merging, some being downgraded from a level 4 to level 3.
So they're doing that, and then at the same time, they are picking some others at random it appears to me, and just reviewing the funding cap. So that process is going on. The vast majority of those funding caps, surprise, surprise, where they are reviewed downwards. There have been a couple that have been reviewed upwards, but they're either untouched or reviewed downwards. So, and I think that is part of, you know, the government trying to make sure that it is getting value for money out of its apprenticeships. Sadly, the processes, internal processes, are very opaque, so nobody really understands how they come to their decisions. They just
and you can't challenge them,
and you can't challenge them.
Yeah.
So they are using the original Trailblazer groups to help them with that process.
The employer group, so everybody doesn't know how much these things should take.
It isn't entirely being done at random, but you know, it is something that people out there need to watch out for. Just because an apprenticeship standard you use is valued at X at the moment doesn't mean forever it'll be valued at X.
And for those who don't know, every apprenticeship has a kind of a tariff, shall we say, that the government recommends at the maximum that you can draw down through your levy. It doesn't say you can't pay more or less, but that's the government kind of putting a price, if you like, on it. Okay, I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think we've got 3 or 4 more points. There's new standards being released. 400-ish.
There's just over 400.
Do you know any hints of anything you know that's coming downstream?
I think what's 500 by the end of this year.
500, wow.
Yeah, no, sorry, 500 by next May. Sorry, 500 by May 2020. That's the target. I don't know of any specific ones that are coming down, but you know, there are still, I think there are still 300 in development at various stages. Now, they won't all see the light of day. One of them, quite interesting and quite controversial, that I have been involved in, is a business administration level 2 standard.
Now, big debates around that.
Huge debates around that. I think have already rejected 2 former proposals to develop that in the past. So there's another group of over 40 employers, public and private sector, who are supportive of that, and the proposal's just gone in. Now, the reason why I mention that is historically, the business level 2 admin has been the introductory apprenticeship for a 16-year-old school leaver going to work in an office, stereotype for a moment. And you know, there is still the old framework there, but it's so poorly funded that very few people can afford to deliver it. So we'll see. That could be a bit of a game changer for the level 2 numbers we were talking about earlier, if that standard's allowed to go forward.
So the next one is the old frameworks are being switched off regardless of what it is, isn't it? July next year is the latest party line that we're getting. If I can link something into that, I mean, that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, as we sit here today, Richard.
But the other thing obviously that's happening is T-levels are starting to filter through in the school and college, mainly the college sector. I think it's fair to say we'll deliver those, but there will be some in schools. What impact, if any, is that going to have, both the frameworks being shut down and T-level starting, on those level 2 apprenticeships?
I mean, who knows about T-level? I am, because I was extensively involved in the old 14 to 19 diplomas about 7 or 8, 9, 10 years ago, whatever it was, and they just disappeared overnight when we had a general election. I think the jury's still out on T-levels, so you know. I think,
what about I mean, if the frameworks are going, I don't know how many frameworks there are, but have they all been replaced with standards?
It is interesting that the last month, for which we have stats, that still nearly 40% of all new starts on apprenticeships were on a framework.
Wow.
I think it's 37, 38%. Now, so a third of new apprenticeship starts are still on a framework, and government is intending in 13 months' time to turn all of those off for new starts. Obviously, people already on programme will be allowed to finish, but you know, from the 1st of August 2020, you won't be able to start anybody on a framework. Now, so frameworks are still inherently very popular. There are some key areas like the business admin level 2 where there is not yet a replacement standard, and don't be surprised if that date slips a bit further.
Okay, all right.
Because of that reason.
Okay, so the final thing, just to briefly talk about, you may or may not know, audience, that most apprenticeships will have either a professional qualification, and Tony's evident some of those, or you know, in the case of IT, for example, perhaps a vendor qualification, so mandatory qualification built into the standard. There's talk that might change in the knowledge modules. Do you have any intel on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are now in a world where originally, when new apprenticeships came in, you know, they were without qualifications. There is a growing demand at lower levels beyond degree apprenticeships, which of course have a, you know, that though within them, where you know, it is quite interesting. And I think what's happening is the government are listening to a bit more about employer and sector representation on this. So I think their view of all of that space will become a bit more flexible over time, and where there's a genuine demand for it, it will be there.
Okay.
But there definitely has to, there are still some quite strict rules around it.
Okay. Sam, back to you for our final poll before we close, because we're virtually at our hour. So if you could just launch.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so audience, for the last time, please submit your response for the final poll. And there we are. So I can see audience voting.
What are the scores, Sam?
The scores are 100%. So they would spend more of the apprenticeship levy. Oh, bear with me. That response has just gone off screen. They said they would spend more of the apprenticeship levy fund.
Everybody, that's wonderful news. So that's good for the sector as a whole, and delighted to hear that that people are going to do that. So it just remains for me to once again thank Tony for his time today. As always, insightful and interesting. You really do have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. So thank you once again. Thank you very much for dialing in. You'll see on the final slide that we will, as Sam said at the outset, this webinar has been recorded, so we will send the link out to everybody that registered. We will also give you the opportunity on that link to download the guide, you know, 8 ways to utilise your levy. But if you need to get in contact with either Tony or myself to take advantage of his expertise in helping you, whether you're an employer or a training provider, Tony's email address is on the screen there. Likewise, if you need any advice or guidance, my email address is there. Always delighted to have conversations about helping you set up apprenticeship programs. So thank you very much for your participation today. I hope you have a fantastic rest of Thursday and look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.
Thanks.